We all think we know what an introvert is, right? But what if all those stereotypes are just the tiniest tip of the iceberg? Well, today, we're going to dive deep into the science of the introvert's mind. And trust me, what we'll find is a wild mix of psychology, brain science, and a really cool paradox about stress. So, when you hear the word introvert, I bet your mind probably jumps to some of these words on the left, right? Shy, loner, maybe a little awkward. But look at the list on the right. Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, J.K. Rowling, Larry Page, some of the most influential people who ever lived. So what gives? How do we connect these two totally different ideas? Well, that's exactly what we're going to figure out. All right, so first things first, we've got to clear the air and get past all those common ideas. We need to figure out what introvert actually means. And to do that, we have to go way back to the guy who literally invented the term, the psychiatrist Carl Jung. Now, for him, it was all about where you get your energy from. He said it's an orientation in life through subjective psychic contents, which is a fancy way of saying you're focused on your inner world, your thoughts, your feelings, your ideas. It's not about being antisocial, not at all. It's about whether you recharge by looking inward or out. Okay, and this brings us to the biggest mix-up of all. Introversion versus shyness. They are so not the same thing. Look at this. Introversion is a preference. You just prefer quieter, less stimulating places. Simple as that. Shyness, though, that's a fear. It's about being worried about what other people think of you. An introvert might skip a party to read a book and be perfectly happy. A shy person might skip that same party but feel totally anxious about it. It's a huge difference. So if it's just a preference, where does that come from? Well, this is where it gets really interesting. Modern science tells us it's not just some personality quirk. Nope. It's actually wired into our biology. So let's take a look inside the introvert's brain. One of the big ideas here is something called Eysenck's arousal theory. A psychologist named Hans Eysenck came up with this. He basically said the huge difference between introverts and extroverts all comes down to one thing: how their brains handle stimulation, or what scientists call arousal. And this is where it kind of flips what you'd expect on its head. The theory goes that extroverts are actually chronically under-aroused. Their baseline is low, so they go looking for loud parties and big crowds to get their brains up to speed. But introverts, they're the opposite. Their brains are naturally over-aroused. They don't need to go looking for stimulation. They've already got plenty. So for them, that same loud party isn't energizing. It's just too much. Now, if that sounds a little abstract, you're going to love this. It's called the lemon juice test. And yeah, it's as weird as it sounds, but it's a real experiment. Scientists literally put a drop of lemon juice on people's tongues. And get this, introverts produced way more saliva than extroverts. Why? Well, it turns out the part of the brain that handles stimulation is also linked to salivation. So because an introvert's brain is more sensitive to that lemony stimulation, it just makes more spit. It's wild. And we can actually see this stuff in brain scans. Studies show that introverts tend to have more blood flow to their frontal lobes. That's the part of the brain that does all the heavy lifting. Planning, deep thinking, solving problems. Extroverts, on the other hand, have more blood flowing to the parts of the brain that process what's happening outside of them, all the sights, sounds, and emotions. So this isn't just a personality thing. It's a real physical difference in how their brains are working. So with all this focus on the inner world and deep thought, it probably won't surprise you that this leads us to a really fascinating connection: the link between introversion and intelligence. And listen, this isn't just some nice idea. The research shows a pretty strong link here. Now, of course, this doesn't mean every introvert is a genius or that extroverts aren't smart. Not at all. But think about it. The very traits of introversion, like deep focus, really thinking things through, those are the exact same traits that help with tough problems and doing well in school. But this highly sensitive, super active brain, it comes with a twist, a big one. It leads to something researchers call the stress paradox. And it's a really weird finding where the brain and the body seem to be telling two completely different stories about stress. So this all comes from something called the hyperbrain/hyperbody theory. The basic idea is that having that high-powered, super excitable brain we've been talking about can also make you feel the effects of stress more intensely, both in your head and in your body. Which brings up a pretty logical question, right? If you have this hyper brain and you're extra sensitive, are you just doomed to be more stressed out than everyone else? Well, the answer is it's complicated. And this chart is where you can really see the paradox in action. It's so cool. Researchers looked at a group of students with high cognitive ability, a group that's likely to have a lot of introverts, and they found something amazing. Okay, first, look at the bar for psychological stress. When they asked these students how they felt, they reported way more worry and overthinking than their peers. But then, and this is the crazy part, look at the second bar for physiological stress. When they actually measured their body's stress response, like heart rate and stuff, it was the total opposite. These same students showed less of a physical reaction to stress. So their minds are freaking out, but their bodies are weirdly calm. How on earth is that possible? So what explains this huge disconnect? Well, researchers think it's a three-step dance. First, that hyperbrain does what it does best. It worries, it overthinks, it really feels the psychological stress. But then, and this is the secret sauce, that same powerful brain kicks into gear with really effective coping strategies. And the result? Those smart coping mechanisms actually calm down the body's physical stress response. It's like they literally think their way out of a physical reaction. Okay, let's bring this all home. For our last section, let's see how all of this points to a whole new way of thinking about consciousness itself and what makes that inner world of the introvert so incredibly rich. There's this really cutting-edge idea called modular consciousness theory, and it suggests that our experience of being alive is basically a series of what it calls integrated informational states. Just think of them as little packets of consciousness, one after another. But here's the thing, not all packets are the same. Each one has a certain information density, which is just a way of saying how rich or complex it is. And this is how we tie it all back. We can think about the introvert's rich inner life in this way. That tendency to think deeply, to reflect, to connect all these different ideas? That's not just sitting around doing nothing. That's the brain creating a whole string of these super high-density informational packets. The outside might look quiet, but the inner experience is incredibly rich with information. And that really leaves us with a final, big question to think about. It doesn't matter if you're an introvert, an extrovert, or somewhere in the middle. This whole line of thinking kind of forces you to ask yourself, what's the information density of your inner world? Pretty deep, right? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining me.